Hey, friend, Chris here from WideLogicProRules.com, the website that helps you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro. This video is my interview with longtime YouTuber Jonathan Morrison. Jonathan really needs no introduction. I mean, he's been running his very popular tech review channel TLD for a while. It has 2.6 million subscribers online. And in addition to that, he has a second channel called Jonathan and Friends, where he's showing off the songs that he's writing and recording and producing with his friends. And the reason for this interview is because Jonathan is jumped completely into the immersive format of spatial mixing in Logic Pro. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to pick his brain all about, his journey through this immersive format. So the challenges and hurdles that he's had to overcome, the gear that he's using, any feelings particularly about headphone mixing versus speaker mixing. What I thought might be questions that you might have if you've been looking to get into spatial mixing in Logic Pro, but just aren't sure where to start. And if headphones are good enough, if you need the speakers, all those questions that might crop up. So thanks so much to Jonathan for chatting with me over FaceTime, and I hope you enjoy this interview. For everybody who's watching, I'm Chris from Why Logic Pro Rules, and I'm here with Jonathan Morrison, who allowed me to listen to Atmos for the very first time on actual speakers outside of headphones at his space. Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with me. And
absolutely, man.
I'm gonna pepper you with a lot of flattery right now. I hope it doesn't make you uncomfortable, but I just want to emphasize how thankful I am of your generosity. Sean from Apogee, we were both attending the Apogee pre-NAMM event, and he introduced us, and he told me, you got to talk to Jonathan. He's mixing in Atmos, and then he introduced us. You let me hear some of your mixes on your AirPod Maxes, and then you just were like, why don't you just come by the space? And then you had me over from 10:30 a.m. till 6 p.m. for freaking WWDC. We ate, and now you're doing this for me. It's just amazing. This is way more than I thought would come out of this. So.
Oh, no, man. I mean, like I said, I've been watching your videos for a hot minute. You do a phenomenal job, and I've learned a ton from you. And anybody who's excited about the format in Atmos, I'm just geeked out to talk about.
Yeah. So that's mainly, I just have a couple of questions for you, but I guess up until now, for anyone who doesn't know, which I feel like I'm the only person who didn't know, you've been running a tech channel for a while, like a gear review channel called TLD, right?
Yeah.
And just recently, as far as I understand, you've started kind of reemerging with your musical side with Jonathan and Friends on YouTube and elsewhere, right?
Yeah. Yeah, tech was the big thing for a good chunk of the last decade, I would say. And it's, time has flown extremely fast, but I've always had a love for music, and I think video kind of took off. And, for a multitude of reasons, I think I always wanted to get back to music in some form or fashion, and decided to make a giant push over the past couple years, and Atmos kind of just found its way naturally into that, just being into tech and everything. But yeah, I took a step back in the tech space to kind of focus on this and just put everything I kind of had into it. And that's where I'm at till you came over and hung out and got a chance to listen.
I guess what compelled you to get started with Atmos? You mentioned the tech thing, and you do video as well. So I feel like that's probably a big aspect to it. But was there anything in particular about spatial mixing that you were interested in?
Yeah, I think the stars kind of aligned a little bit in the sense when I was familiar with Dolby Vision being in video, and I kind of fell in love with that format and spent a couple years kind of diving in and fine-tuning and figuring out that workflow on the video side. So there was at least the mind awareness, consciousness factor with Dolby Vision. And then, you see Atmos pop up when we watch things on, at home now, or obviously in a movie theater if you can, and get that kind of setup. So there was kind of that preconceived idea of what it was. And then when the Apple Music update dropped and they did lossless, I think we were all expecting lossless at some point. That was a rumor that was kind of, talked about for a minute, but I don't think anybody necessarily thought Atmos or spatial audio was going to happen kind of alongside with that. So once that happened and, they didn't up the price and they kind of included it at no extra cost, I became fascinated with, what it was, what it could be, and immediately just started trying to figure out, everything I could on the format. I knew what Atmos was in terms of cinema, and I was very curious musically. So within that, week, I think I found a video from Dave Way, and he kind of explained something with a binaural representation. And I think the part that just was the light bulb for me was the idea of working, not just frontwards and backwards, but height and working in a box or sphere of sound. And once he kind of demonstrated that you could move things, not only in front of you, behind you, but up or down, I was just like, that's wild. So I was fortunate enough to link up with him, got a chance to hear some of the Atmos mixes he had done, because he had jumped into it, even a couple years prior at like the infancy of it for music. And I was just, as cool as it was as a tech and a format, once I heard it, I was ruined and just immediately just became super interested in it. And I don't think from my end, I necessarily thought mixing or even building a studio around it was the goal at first. I just wanted to make music and, make music in Atmos, which was, we were lucky enough to have Dave mix a couple records for us early on. And I think once you get a little taste of it, it just was super motivating to learn more and more and more and more. And then my personal goal is to figure out how we can do this, at a scale that everybody can do it. From how do we get people to enjoy it on headphones, on sound bars, to someone who's just producing in their bedroom, right? Because the idea and the setup behind it can be daunting. And so this was kind of the first step of like, could we build our own? And then once that happened, how do we scale this, down or up?
At this point in the game, I know for a fact, but you can see in the background, you're running Genelecs. What is the setup that you're working with that you have found to work?
So this setup is a little bit of a hybrid Frankenstein. It's a total of 11 speakers. They're all Genelec. The main difference are the front three, the left, center, right. Those are the ones, where the ones behind them, they're still SAM and GLM. But I think we were in a situation where we had, 11 of those. And I was kind of actually curious, and I asked Genelec, could you do a world where like we had the 714, the 11 speakers of the smaller speaker? Could I add 2 of the ones and then kind of interchange them? And that could be like, your 2.1 or your stereo setup. And, because of GLM, they're like, no, like people mix and match, and that's totally cool to have, bigger mains and then smaller surrounds and sides. So the fact that we were able to do that, and through the calibration, which does, it does timing, it does phase, it does EQ, and the bass management, it just, for us, between that, the Symphony IO, and Logic having the renderer built in, it was kind of a no-brainer. And, from our perspective, it was one of those things where we assumed it would be painful, and it was surprisingly not, because of the trifecta of products, I guess, in this environment.
Sure. So you're running 7.1.4, including a Genelec sub, which I kept commenting on because it looks like a chair. It's so big that you can sit on it. And then you're running the Symphony Mark II IO from Apogee, and they just recently released an update, which basically turned it into an Atmos monitor controller.
Right.
In addition to all the IO. And do you find that particular device, I don't know, have you tried anything prior or after the Mark II?
From my experience, I've seen Dave set up and he's running Focusrites, and that worked incredible for that. I think what was compelling to me about the Symphony IO is there was enough ins and outs in one device to where you didn't have to stack or daisy chain multiple interfaces. So that was probably, the step one in terms of like why this was compelling to me. And then I've been a fan of Apogee for a minute, and they were back in the day. I remember the original Duet and even the Ensemble back when it was silver. So I've always had them in mind. And, over the years with different tech, you kind of mess with different interfaces. I kind of came back to Apogee full force with the Symphony Desktop. And to me, that's still my favorite, like, bang for your buck interface in the world right now, just because of what you get and how good it sounds, and dual headphones, great pre's, just kind of everything in one, which I know you've been a fan of as well. but obviously that's not going to be enough ins or outs to do Atmos. And I've always, kind of drooled at the idea of a Symphony IO and never obviously needed anything with that much power. But in this case, I know they'll market it as plug and play, which I know can sound markety and kind of maybe even gimmicky, but it truly was, like we got to the point where we were waiting on help from an outside company to help us set up. That didn't work out. And one day we just decided to try it ourselves. So we had the speakers, we had the Symphony IO, we plugged everything in, and it was one of those things where it's like, did we do this right? Why is it working? And I think once we did that, it was kind of just green light to really go full force. But from an audio perspective, it's weird. Like even going back to the Symphony desktop, I feel like sonically, whether it's even the demos that I was mixing, like I feel like I got better when I switched to Symphony desktop, and I don't know if it's just using it more or the converters or whatever, but I know you can attest as well, like they sound phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely. I cannot shout it enough from the hilltops how much I love that thing. I think it's incredible. So on top of that, obviously, the speakers, the interface, the last piece is the DAW or the renderer, really. And for a lot of folks, they're using Pro Tools or maybe another DAW with the Dolby renderer. And I'm aware that, and you mentioned it a couple times, that you're using Logic Pro because it's built in natively. And I guess, what's your experience with the renderer in Logic Pro? Is it positive? Are there things that could be improved upon? The good and the bad.
No. Yeah, I think, honestly, I don't know if there's really a bad. Maybe there's a con list because it's not the full Dolby renderer, and there's different iterations of the Dolby renderer. The basic version is like $300, and we've talked about this. The fact that Logic Pro itself is cheaper than that is kind of wild. Now, there are certain limitations, like you can't bounce an MP4 in Logic, which seems wild. So to get like a Atmos ready trackable file, you have to actually do that in the Dolby render and not in Logic. I assume that's coming at some point, but I think it's more of, it's a slightly stripped down version of the Dolby renderer. So there's no negatives minus like if you need specific things, or if you have like the professional suite that does the bass management for you and those kinds of things. I think that one's like $1,000. I would say there are probably a couple advantages in Logic, surprisingly, even if it's not as fully fledged out. One is the head tracking renderer. And I'll be honest, as much as like I'm an Apple dude and a Logic guy, when it first dropped, I was a little underwhelmed. And I think that was because some of the headphone-based binaural mixes or references I was doing in conjunction with the speakers, it was geared for the Dolby renderer. And I think over the past month, starting with the Apple renderer for headphones and for AirPods, using that as the headphone reference, it completely changed everything for me to the point where, it was much more enjoyable and much more impressive on AirPods, which is kind of weird to say, as opposed to before where it was like, okay, on speakers, it's crazy, it's amazing, that's the future. But on headphones, it was a little, maybe not as impressive, or I could see where that may be exciting in the future. Whereas now with that renderer built in, especially having head tracking and being able to see what tracks and what doesn't, that completely changed everything for me. So, in a lot of ways, I think Logic does have some really cool advantages for Atmos. On top of that, just being able to spread a stereo image left or right, or to expand it narrow or wide. And, me and you have gone back and forth, and it seems like the master bus workflow is seeming to work perfectly now, being able to use L2 and Pro Q3 in 712. So things like that, and hopefully that, comes with Pro Tools. But for me personally, I'm just excited to see, any DAW get it, because the more people that are doing it, the more it's going to be a win for everybody.
I agree. I feel similarly. I've only been, listening in headphones, and I've been very careful and just sort of exploring it. But I found the Apple renderer more believable in headphones than the Dolby renderer. And
right.
I don't know, maybe my head size just kind of works for that, renderer right now. But I feel like that the way they've tuned the space, I get a sense that sounds are bouncing off of walls, and thus I get a better sense of where things are. Where maybe the Dolby
Right.
renderer is more tuned for like a studio space without reverberation or something. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I mean the honest thing is like Apple, like they do. I mean, they've had so many things. There's a I talk about it a bunch on the tech side of things, but there's definitely a butterfly effect from Apple where they take one piece of technology and there's almost like the initial product that was sacrificed just to do the greater good of the other product. And in a lot of ways that was the HomePod, which that tech and that team ended up passing the technology onto AirPods, which then that went to MacBook speakers and to studio display speakers. So there's this huge, circle of Apple working on these things that are not only hardware based but software based as well. And I think the fact that they're so finely tuned for AirPods is why it translates better for that portion of the renderer. And I think once you get the best of both worlds where you can reference on AirPods, it works great, binaurally just with a regular set of wired headphones as well. And then you throw in a physical, 3D space with speakers and that kind of setup, then you're kind of geared to do, the best at both.
Yeah. To one point that you mentioned earlier, I don't know if you're aware, but though Logic doesn't have the ability to export an MP4, you can bounce a binaural surround bounce.
Yep.
And that's apparently like the Band-Aid for, and you can do it with the Apple renderer and the Dolby renderer, so like their own things. Cool.
Right. Yeah, I like that. I think for me, it's been fun to sync the video because I've been able to get it to the point where we can sync a visual with the MP4 so people can download it and throw AirPods on and then not only physically hear like a binaural representation, but they're actually hearing the Atmos file with head tracking. So they're hearing what it's going to sound like on Apple Music. Whereas if you just had the binaural, you would lose the head tracking.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Is there anything particularly challenging about Atmos or immersive mixing that you've found?
I think it's probably the lack of resources and content and just like knowing what exactly is correct and what's not. It's a new technology, so that was probably the most overwhelming thing for me, especially starting to get into the world where like I'm gonna take a stab at a mix and there's a little bit of information out there, right? Logic's guide is kind of okay. It gives you kind of the basic skeleton of what you need. We know that we can't be louder than -18 LUFS, which is wildly different than stereo. And anybody who's coming from the stereo loudness wars and then they come over to that, like, -18 on a mix would be crazy. And so I think, it's just more of just not knowing what's technically correct. Just because there's not a ton of resources out there would be my answer. But I feel like it's getting, more and more adopted. More people are doing that, bigger studios, bigger mixers. And again, the fact that it's part of Apple Music and labels are starting to ask for it, I think that's a good sign that it's here to stay. And with that, hopefully the resources follow.
Yeah. And my last question, the opposite side of that coin, what do you find easy or intuitive about spatial mixing? I guess based on headphones or the speakers or both.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, like we talked about, it's probably a bit of my ignorance in the music mixing space. I think, I enjoy writing, playing, producing, composing. Mixing is something that was kind of, I don't think I wanted to do it per se, but it's just like we talked about, you want your demos and your productions to sound as good as they can. So you end up watching videos and learning from people, or you see like a Dave Way or an Andrew Dawson, and it's impossible not to pick up on something. So I think, piece by piece, learning little bits of tricks here and there on mixing and then applying that to Atmos. And my brain is already coming from a visual world anyways. So if I'm listening to a piece of music, I'm constantly visualizing where that is in my own 3D space of my brain. So I think, once you have that and you do a lot of proactive listening, for me, it makes it easier just because I kind of know where I'd want to place it in my brain and in this space, and even to the extent where we're starting to write and arrange and create things for Atmos in mind ahead of time. So it's less of a reactive thing in the mix, but more of like, okay, we kind of knew this was going to be here from the conception of the song.
Mm-hmm. That's super cool. I could definitely see that. Because for me, when I was sitting in your space, it's like a whole new part of my brain that I need to start like tuning into, because even sitting with all the speakers, I was like, do I hear things above me? Do I hear them behind me? I mean, obviously I was, but it's like isolating specific sounds around.
Right. Yeah, it's fun because it's, it is cinematic, like you said. And I think, my brain is, I'm constantly making a movie or a TV show off life moments in general. So I'm constantly playing the movie in my head. And I think, when you do get a chance to listen to some of Bob's mixes, they're very, story based. And I feel like that's one of the core things about this is it's a chance to tell a story in a different way and to create space and to create moments and to create a scene in music that maybe would have got lost, especially in today's world with everything, 2-track squashed, and we lose a little bit of that story-based element of music sometimes.
Absolutely. And just for anybody who's not aware, you're referring to Bob Clearmountain, like legendary music producer and mix engineer, and he's gone into Atmos, and you and him both did actually like a presentation or a Q&A around Atmos for Apogee at NAMM, which hopefully Apogee releases some of that footage, because I thought it was very helpful. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, cool, man. Those are my questions for you. I don't want to take up all your time. I mean, you've given so much already, so I appreciate it. Is there anything you want to hit on, or, like a call to action or a mission or anything?
Nah, like I'm good, man. I'm excited for people to get out there and do it. So for the people who watch this channel, Chris does an amazing job, and keep watching his stuff. For anybody out there who has Logic and AirPods, I would just say don't be afraid. Don't feel like you have to get out there and buy 11 speakers to start messing with it, because I think there's a lot you can do with the limited amount. And a MacBook, Logic Pro, AirPods, it's going to at least help you get into that space and start to think of it. And you can reference stuff on Apple Music. And by the time you get to a place where, you can check out a studio that has Atmos, like you're going to be so far into it by then that you're not going to feel behind. So that's my only call to action from this thing, is just anybody who's kind of curious, don't wait for speakers to try it. I think the tech and the affordability is going to catch up sooner than later, but the fact that we can do something even remotely close on AirPods tells you kind of everything you need to know.
Cool. Well, I appreciate it. I'll be sure, absolutely, I will link to everything Jonathan Morrison in the description below, to your tech channel, TLD, to Jonathan and Friends, Instagram, the whole 9. I will post it all. And just thanks so much again, man, for your time and for everything.
Anytime, man.